great to have Tsin Ko here from Singapore. It looks almost as sunny as Singapore as it is in London this morning. And Tsin is at the Yale-NUS college in Singapore. She's sort of got an almost, well, what could be a sort of a perfect trajectory in a sense for doing intellectual history, because she did PPE at Oxford for her first degree, then went on to Cambridge to do the MPhil in political thought and intellectual history, and then went to Harvard to do her PhD in political science. Her interests are generally in 18th and 19th century political thought, but more importantly, from our point of view, she's working very much primarily on Bentham. And she's had, Tsin had 2 articles published recently, one in the history of European ideas on Bentham on asceticism and tyranny, and another one in the history of political thought, which came out earlier this year on Bentham and the pleasures of cruelty. And if you've not seen those, I highly recommend them. And Tsin, I understand, is working on a book on Bentham, and is in particular his writings on sexual morality and on religion. And today's seminar is entitled Bentham on Religion. So Tsin, we're looking forward to hearing your paper.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction and for having me here today. So it's great to be able to join you. So I have slides. Should I attempt to share them? Sorry. Does that work?
Yeah, that's working.
Great, thank you. So the paper today is on religion and judgment in Bentham's political thought. One of the charges Bentham made against the Church of England was of aiming at and achieving to some degree the frustration of understanding and will. This phrase was taken from a recent sermon by Bishop Howley, in which the bishop warned against the dangers of Unitarianism. The influence of Unitarianism, he said, was fortunately as yet confined to men of some education who had not spent much thought on religion, or who, loving rather to question than to learn, had approached the oracles of divine truth without that humble docility, that prostration of the understanding and will, which were indispensable to proficiency in Christian instruction. Bentham took the phrase to represent the Church's desiderata and its members more generally. Prostration of understanding and will, he declared, was in one word slavery, and a more absolute slavery than that to be found in Barbary or the West Indies. And the only reason he could think of for the establishment of a system of slavery was the exercise of a corresponding tyranny over the people enslaved. Despotism and slavery were 2 sides of the same coin. In Bentham's words, he who as towards one man acts the part of a despot is but the more fitted for acting towards another man that of a slave. So many men as there are, one above another, standing in these relations to one another, so many links are there in the chain of slavery. So the prostration of understanding and will was a 2-part act. The prostration of will was sufficient to form links in the chain of despotism and slavery, but the prostration of the understanding was necessary to make the chain perpetual. Bentham's language is a little exaggerated, perhaps. At any rate, some of his contemporaries and some more recent scholars have thought so. Contemporary reviews of Church of Englandism fell along predictable lines. The Examiner, which was generally supportive of Bentham, praised the work for striking a great number of irresistible blows at the roots of bigotry and worldliness. And the British Critic Quarterly Review, which were not generally supportive, attributed the composition of the work to insanity and malevolence, respectively. So in this paper, I propose to take Bentham's charge seriously and to make 2 broad arguments here. First, that Bentham thought that religion, the form of the Church of England in particular, and Christian doctrine in general, had a corruptive effect on the faculty of judgment. And second, and relatedly, that the corruption of judgment undermined the effectiveness of representative democracy in bringing about the greatest happiness of the greatest number. The the first, just as an outline. For one, the church discouraged free criticism of its doctrines and practices and encouraged an uncritical reliance on its authority. So this view, reading the Church of Englandism, not so much as a defense of the right to private judgment, which is not the focus of this paper, but as a critique of the church's claim to intellectual authority. For another, religion could corrupt judgment, even without the benefit of an established church, by undermining the empirical basis of knowledge. The thought is that while belief could not be compelled, it could be influenced, and specifically could be influenced by the prospect of pleasure or pain. The promise of eternal happiness in return for belief in a supreme deity and associated beliefs, and the threat of eternal misery for disbelief in the same, could skew a consideration of evidence and arguments, and encourage believers to pay selective attention only to such evidence and arguments which supported their preferred conclusion. And in both these cases, with regard to the church or to religious belief more generally, the corruption of judgment had real effects on happiness and misery in this present life. The second broad argument is that the corruption of judgment had a detrimental effect on the effectiveness of representative democracy in bringing about the greatest happiness of the greatest number. The thought here is that the advantage of representative democracy over other forms of government, in Bentham's political thought, depended on the collective judgment of the electorate, both as individual voters and in the form of public opinion, public judgment, as it were. There are two distinctions which might be useful here, both from the plan for parliamentary reform. The first distinction is between a self-formed and a derivative judgment. In the plan, Bentham called for radical parliamentary reform through such measures as a virtually universal suffrage, annual elections, and a secret ballot. He did acknowledge that there was a concern, perhaps, that newly enfranchised voters might not know enough about the business of government to vote wisely. That is, they might not be able to depend on their self-formed judgment. However, they could depend on their derivative judgment, derived, for example, from public opinion. After all, many people relied on derivative opinion, including public opinion, for a number of important decisions in private lives, such as those to do with medicine, the law, or religion. So it would not be a stretch for voters to do so as well. The second distinction is between the influence of will on will and the influence of understanding on understanding. One of the measures Bentham called for in the plan was the secret ballot. A vote should ideally be the expression of the voter's own will, his self-formed will, as it were, and not, for example, the expression of the will of the person who bought the vote. So a secret ballot would eliminate the influence of will on will in elections, as manifested, for example, through bribery or intimidation, and leave only the influence of understanding on understanding. But generally, this is a reading of religion as a species of delusion, where delusion is an instrument of misrule. And the phrase comes from some of the essays in First Principles preparatory to Constitutional Code. And the effect of delusion, generally speaking, were to weaken the moral and intellectual faculties of the people who propagated or accepted the delusion, and as a result, and in addition, to justify the prevailing power structure, the power asymmetry between the governors and the governed. So the frustration of understanding, in other words, leads to the frustration of the will. This reading follows recent and not that recent scholarship in reading Bentham's writings on religion as part of his political thought. But the emphasis here is not on the church as an example of the influence of will and will, not, for example, on the sinister influence of the episcopacy over the wills of their followers, on the opposition between the churchmen as a class and the universal interest. Instead, the thought is that Bentham's writings on religion draw attention to a less remarked upon aspect of his political thought, namely his concern with the influence of understanding on understanding, and more specifically with the ways in which judgment could be systematically distorted and manipulated in support of an oppressive and unjust political regime. So for the rest of this paper, I'm going to start the corruption of derivative judgment with respect to the church, and then talk a bit about the corruption of self-formed judgment with respect to natural religion or to Christian religion, and conclude with some implications for Bentham's theory of representative democracy. Begin with the Church. In the Book of Fallacies, Bentham observed that there seemed to be a universal propensity among human beings to take not only facts, but opinions on trust. In morality and politics, for example, he said, in the table of the springs of action, 99 out of 100 people have an adoptive judgment. This is not a denunciation of derivative judgment exactly, as implied in the plan. There was a place for it. The more important question was, from what source of authority was the judgment derived? How should one distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate, or more or less trustworthy sources of authority? Bentham proposed a scale of authoritative trustworthiness in the Book of Fallacies, depending on such factors as the intelligence and probity of the authority figure, her access to information, and her interest in collecting and evaluating evidence. So the top of the scale was intellectual, professional, scientific authority. The professional scientist, assuming she had relative and adequate intelligence and probity, was likely to have the means to gather information and a professional interest in forming a well-reasoned judgment based on this information. And Bentham offered himself as an example of such an authority in the legal sphere. And next in the scale, in descending order of trustworthiness, was authority from power, from opulence, and from general reputation. So in this paper, I read Church of Englandism as a challenge to the intellectual authority of the Church. The Church professed to have, and was commonly thought to have, intellectual authority, on one basis of which Bishop Howley, for example, called for the prostration of understanding and will. Bentham sought to challenge the intellectual authority of the Church in two ways: by exposing what he thought to be the moral and intellectual contradictions of the Catechism, which was used to teach both reading and religion to young children, and by arguing that the Church had substituted its own religion, Church of Englandism, for what he called the genuine religion of Jesus, just as it had substituted its Catechism for the Bible as a teaching text. And the advantage of this reading is that it gives Bentham's critique of the Catechism a starring role in the book. It's ostensibly the main text of the book, though it comprises about 10% of the entire work. So for the first challenge, the method used here was to offer a line-by-line critique of the Catechism, same method he used in Blackstone's commentaries, and arguably for the same purpose, to challenge Blackstone's intellectual authority. The Catechism was used to teach children to read and write in schools established by a national society, which was itself set up under the auspices of the Church, and as a response to the popularity of the Lancaster schools, which were established by Joseph Lancaster, the Quaker educationist, and open to pupils of all religious denominations, and the Lancaster schools used the Bible as a teaching text. The problem with the Catechism as a teaching text, according to Bentham, was that it taught children things which are useless in practical life, unintelligible to young minds, inconsistent with clerical practice, or simply mendacious. For example, the Catechism taught children that their godparents had committed them to renouncing, among other things, the devil and all his works, as well as the pomps and vanity of this wicked world. But it did not go on to explain what the devil or his works were, or what renunciation required. The pomps and vanity of this world might perhaps require no explanation, but the injunction to renounce them, in Bentham's view, was inconsistent with experience, if not downright hypocritical. The monarch, the aristocrats, and the bishops had demonstrably failed to renounce ostentatious displays of power and wealth in this world. More generally, the Catechism sought to teach children to believe in things they could not yet understand, because the faculty of reason was not yet sufficiently developed. At this point in their lives, the children were, in Bentham's words, completely incompetent to the forming of any judgment or so much as a conception on these matters, and so were not able truly to believe in the articles of the Catechism. What it could and did teach them was to profess belief in its articles, that is, it taught them to lie. So on this view, the Catechism was not an effective instrument of education, But it was an effective instrument of corruption, for in Bentham's words, corrupting altogether the intellectual part, to a great extent the moral part of the minds thus impregnated. And it did so by habituating young minds to the practice of mendacity and insincerity, and in that way weakening their ability and willingness to recognize and protest against abuses of power. The second challenge, the intellectual authority of the Church. Bentham argued that the Catechism lacked intellectual authority as a foundational text of a religion. It was a substitute for the Bible, but a poor substitute who did not provide what he called a true picture of the religion of Jesus. It was, in fact, so poor a substitute for the Bible that the religion it taught was not the religion of Jesus, but a different one, the religion of the Church, or Church of Englandism. So the prostration of the understanding that Bishop Harley called for was due not to God, but to Church, that is, to man. And the oracles of divine truth that the bishop mentioned were not the literal word of God, and not even of Scripture, but of doctrines deducible by the established laws of interpretation from Scripture, laws that is established by church officers. But if the authority of the Church was not based on intellectual expertise, then what was it based on? This passage is from Bishop Harley's sermon towards the end of it, where he urges clergymen to pay close attention to the national schools. In proportion to your success of your attention to this important point, the course of your ministry will become smooth and easy. Your parishioners from the infancy initiated in the principles and inured to the practice of pure Christianity will crowd a pious affection to the altars of their mother church. Your instructions and exhortations received in humble docility as the oracles of God by congregations who revere in your persons the dispensers of divine truth will no longer be wasted on a barren soil. From this passage, it seems as if Bentham and Harley were in agreement on the effects of the Catechism in indoctrinating young minds and cultivating in them a reverence for the Church and its officers. From Bentham's perspective, however, this was not a beneficial effect. The Catechism did not only fail to teach children anything of practical use, but it actively contributed to their moral and intellectual deprivation. It prepared them for the submission of their judgment and so of their will to the authority of the Church. So in this account, the authority of the Church is not based on intellectual expertise, but on power, further down in the scale of trustworthiness. The desired outcome of the bishop and of the Church, in Bentham's words, was the establishment of a state of things, which, when described in plain English, is neither more nor less, for what else is it, than a system of slavery, of intellectual and thence as a necessary consequence of moral and corporeal slavery, in which the officers of the Church were the tyrants, the lay members the subjects, and all other people were enemies. So the Catechism, as an instrument for the corruption of judgment, was thereby an instrument of tyranny. Now turn to the corruptive influence of Christian doctrine on self-formed judgment, or look at belief in natural religion. The thought is that opinions and judgments should ideally be made after careful consideration of the evidence and arguments. So in the natural state of things, Bentham said in the analysis of the influence of natural religion, a man assents to that which he thinks is the best evidence, dissents from what appears to be refuted by the best evidence. And in such circumstances, there is nothing to guide his choice except the evidence. Religious belief could corrupt the process of forming a judgment in two ways: by offering incentives for specific beliefs, and so skewing the process of collecting and considering evidence and arguments, or more generally, by undermining the empirical basis of knowledge. I should register a couple of caveats here. The text used in this section is the analysis of the influence of natural religion, and there is a question as to the fidelity of the analysis to Bentham's own views. I'm following Catherine Fuller in this. She examined the analysis in Bentham's manuscripts on the utility of religion and concluded that the work echoes Bentham's text and summaries, though it was rewritten to accommodate George Grove's own thoughts and in his own style. So I'm going to take the analysis as more or less reflective of Bentham's views, particularly where it is consistent with his other writings, even though the language is quite different. And the other caveat is that by religion, I have in mind primarily the Christian religion. The analysis discusses natural religion without the aid of revelation, but the characteristics of natural religion which it lists, such as belief in the existence of a supreme deity and its agency in this world, and in a system of reward and punishment in the afterlife, are characteristics of revealed religion too. And I think it is fair to say that Bentham and Grote had Christianity in their sights. So to begin with the first way by which religion could corrupt judgment, one of the mischiefs of natural religion, according to the analysis, was that it disqualified the understanding for purposes useful in this life by promising eternal happiness as a reward for belief in a supreme deity, and so on, and eternal misery as a punishment for disbelief. This is not to say that reward or punishment could directly influence belief. The will cannot act quite so directly on the understanding. For example, one cannot make a man believe he was not sitting in a chair when he was doing so, and not holding a book in his hand when he was doing so, and these are Bentham's examples. But not all judgments are so obvious or immediate. It may not be possible to make a person really and immediately believe in the truth of a thing he knew to be false, but it was possible to make him do any or all of these things. 1, to refrain from declaring his disbelief in it. 2, to make him declare his belief in it. 3, to make him turn instantly aside from all considerations tending to confirm him in his disbelief of it. And 4, to look out for and fix his attention on all considerations tending to induce him to believe in it, especially authority. I'd like to draw your attention to attention. For Bentham, the faculty of judgment was a faculty of the understanding, but the faculty of attention was a faculty of the will. To pay attention to something was to fasten one's mind, as it were, by an act of the will to the thing in question. So even if we could all agree that judgments should be based on evidence, it would not be always clear what counts as evidence, or what weight we should give to conflicting pieces of evidence. And paying selective attention to different pieces of evidence or different arguments could lead to different judgments on the matter. And what we paid attention to depended on our motives, that is, on the prospect of pleasure or pain. And for religion, the relevant motives are hope and fear. Hope of eternal happiness and fear of eternal misery. I'd like to give 2 examples, both which happen to be taken from Blackstone's commentaries. And the example, so at any rate, the terrors conjured up by religion might push us into paying more attention to certain kinds of evidence and forming opinions that we might not, with a clearer mind, have formed. For example, the discussion of witchcraft in the commentaries. Blackstone appears to have been divided in his opinion. On the one hand, he thought the empirical evidence of witchcraft was sketchy at best, if not outright delusional. On the other hand, he thought that the contrary evidence, especially from the Bible, was also extremely strong. Bentham, on the contrary, judging from his sardonic remarks about Blackstone's and his own grandmother's belief in witches, did not think that biblical references to witches were sufficient evidence for their existence, or any evidence at all. And one could say that religious belief skewed judgment in this area, by encouraging a person to pay selective attention to evidence, such as the biblical mention of witches, which supported their preferred conclusion. Another example is sodomy. Should the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in the Bible be considered as evidence for the harmfulness of sodomy? Blackstone answered in the affirmative in his commentaries. He pointed out that sodomy was a capital offense, according to the voice of nature and of reason and the express law of God, as evidence for the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah by fire from heaven. Bentham addressed this point in his arguments against the punishment of sodomy and other nonconformist sexual practices. In the third Not Paul but Jesus volume, for example, he argued that the destruction of the 2 cities was not on the basis of sodomy, but a forcible rape and a violation of hospitality. So perhaps, if one took seriously the threat of the devil and all his works, and of the prospect of eternal misery, one would put more weight than Bentham did on the burning of the cities as evidence of the sinfulness of sodomy. Or perhaps, without the influence of religion, the biblical event would not be considered evidence at all. The second way by which religion could corrupt judgment generally was by undermining the empirical basis of knowledge. Knowledge here refers to useful knowledge of pleasure and pain in this world, and it depended, according to the analysis, on believing facts conformable to experience. But religion demanded belief in things for which there was not and could not be empirical experience. The very basis of natural religion was therefore an article of extra experimental belief, a belief altogether unconformable to experience. Extra experimental belief is George Grove's term, but I think it was generally reflective of Bentham's thoughts in this area. But if experience were not the basis of knowledge, then there would be no reliable way of acquiring knowledge useful in this world. There would, for example, be no way to refute falsehoods based on their inconsistency with past events, and no way of establishing means of reliably producing pleasure or avoiding pain in this world. So the influence of judgment, religion and judgment had the most destructive consequences in this present life. The belief in witchcraft, for example, had led to the persecution and condemnation of many innocent women, and the victims of witch hunts and witch trials could be thought of as sacrifices to extra experimental belief. Another example of the destructive consequences was trial by ordeal, which seems a good illustration of the surrender of human judgment to an alien, unaccountable judgment, the effect of which was to protect the guilty from appropriate punishment and to maximize the suffering of the innocent. So the influence of religion and judgment was generally to deprave the understanding and weaken our capacity for judgment, whether self-formed judgments or derivative judgments, depending on the authority from which we derived our judgments. And the corruption of judgment generates real harms in this world. What does judgment have to do with Bentham's political thought exactly? And by way of conclusion, I have 2 points here. First is that judgment mattered for representative democracy, because the effectiveness of representative democracy in advancing the universal interest depended on the collective judgment of the electorate, individually and as public opinion. And the second is on religion as a species of delusion, and so as an instrument of misrule. And why judgment mattered for representative democracy? In the Book of Fallacies, Bentham remarked that the preeminence of democratic above every other form of government, and even the possibility of its existence, depended upon a distinction between a self-formed judgment and a derivative one. The advantage of representative democracy over other forms of government was that it was more likely to result in the alignment of interests between the governors and the governed. In his essay on the identification of interests, for example, Bentham said that the greatest happiness of the greatest number required, to the greatest extent possible, the identification of interests between public functionaries and the community at large. And at the time of writing the plan of parliamentary reform, however, the two domineering interests in Britain, the monarchical and aristocratic interests, were at odds with the universal democratical interest. It was not unexpected that the ruling classes should rule in their own interest, but what was needed was a political system that produced an alignment or identification of interests between the ruling few and the subject many. And if there were virtually universal suffrage, then more individual interests would be comprehended in the universal interest. That is, the universal interest would trend towards the truly universal. But all that only worked if voters could be relied upon to know their interest and to vote for candidates who would further their common interest. And that is where Bentham's reassurance and derivative judgment comes in. Even if voters could be relied upon to vote wisely on the basis of their self-formed judgment, they could be expected to do so on the basis of the derivative judgment. But the soundness of derivative judgment depended on the trustworthiness of the authority from which it was derived. And the argument Bentham made was that the church was not a trustworthy source of authority, not in non-religious matters, including laws based on religion, and not on religious matters really either. Religion could corrupt public opinion too. Bentham thought that public opinion was mostly effective as a security against misrule, but with a few exceptions, cases in which public opinion had turned, whether out of want of sufficient maturity or sinister interest, against acts which were innocuous. One example was the public intolerance towards religious dissent, and another one was public antipathy towards sexual nonconformity, which was exacerbated by religious or ascetic attitudes towards sex. In Sextus, for example, one of his essays on sexual nonconformity, Bentham argued that sexual liberty would result in a benefit to genuine morality from the exclusion of false and spurious morality. And the thought was that spurious moral demands, as generated by the antipathy towards sexual nonconformity, for example, could crowd out genuine moral demands. A genuine morality would aim at the increase of public happiness, not the decrease of it. But the point, and almost the last point, is that we can think of religion as a species of delusion, but delusion is an instrument of misrule. In his essays on the supreme operative and constitutional code rationale, Bentham discussed instruments of misrule. The corporeal or real instruments were the soldier, the lawyer, the priest, the incorporeal instruments, of force, intimidation, corruption, and delusion. Delusion was the instrument of both the lawyer and the priest, used for the same purposes, to further their particular interest and the interest of the monarch, but in different ways. The terrors invented by the lawyer, for example, were confined to this present life, while the terrors invented by the priest knew no such bounds. One example of delusion in action was in the use of legal fictions. The effect of legal fictions was a demoralization of the moral faculties of the people who used or accepted them. The principle of demoralization offered an alternative moral principle, one that said that the approbation and disapprobation of acts did not depend on the greatest happiness or the greatest good, but on the practice, consequently on the will, and thence on the interest of the class of lawyers. The object and effect of the principle of demoralization was to inure people to the perpetration of injustice and, in a word, political evil in all its shapes, and to the use of mendacity in perpetrating this injustice. Another example of delusion action was a delusion generated by factitious honors. In the plan of parliamentary reform, after reassuring readers that voters could vote wisely on the basis of their derivative judgment, Bentham suggested that, in any case, the same men who currently determine the course of an election by the influence of will and will would, for the most part, continue to exercise the same control over elections by the influence of understanding, real or imputed, on understanding. This was because people in general, and especially the most uninformed classes, tended to place an outsized and unjustified importance on birth and wealth as indicators of appropriate aptitude for political position or office. Bentham was less sanguine about this tendency in constitutional code rationale. In that essay, he argued that one effect of factitious honor was that it generated the delusion that people in positions of power deserved their positions because they possessed the appropriate aptitude for such positions, or because they had more social affection and benevolence than the people they governed. The convention not to speak ill of the dead was one manifestation of this delusion, as was the convention to represent the powerless, the unopulent, the undignified, as less benevolent, less knowing, less judicious, and less able than they were, and to represent men of power, wealth, and dignity as more benevolent and more able than they were. The result of this delusion was to make people dupes, and so to make them slaves. to discourage them from questioning the qualifications of the people in power, and to reconcile them to their subject status. But the effect of fictitious honor was therefore to delude people. In Bentham's words, delude, and to what further end? Only that by means of the delusion they may with the less discontent submit to be plundered and oppressed. So from these examples, we could say that the general effect of delusion, whether in the form of religious, legal, or political delusions, was moral and intellectual deprivation, which served to bolster the claims of the ruling few to power and to wealth and to honors, and to reconcile the subject many to their inferior position. That is to say, in the admittedly somewhat exaggerated language of Church of Englandism, that the effect of delusion was to produce the prostration of understanding and will, and so forge links in the chain of despotism and slavery. So as mentioned in this talk, I have followed some recent scholarship in reading the writings on religion as part of Bentham's political thought, and as part of his concern of the users and abusers of power. But the emphasis here is not on the influence of will on will, but on the influence of understanding on understanding, on the ways in which judgment and belief could be systematically distorted and manipulated to further the partial and sinister interests of the ruling classes and at the expense of the universal interest. Thank you very much, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Many thanks indeed, Tsin. That was a terrific paper, and really interesting the way in which you've linked Bentham's religious writings to his political thought, and particularly his writings on democracy in a I think a very insightful and original way. So now we have some time for questions, and just to repeat what Tim said earlier, if you have a question to ask, you can use the hand symbol on the the bar which comes up when you hover your cursor over the screen, or else type something into the meeting chat box, which you can also activate by clicking on the speech bubble on the bar of icons. Okay, so let's begin questions. I mean, let me start with the general one, and it's something I've sort of puzzled over, but never really looked at in detail. So, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it, Tsin, and that's a bit more about the connection of the relationship between will and understanding. So, I mean, that's a broad question, but I'm really interested to hear how you conceive of that relationship in general terms.
I think it is. Thank you so much for the question, and I have some thoughts on that. I might be a bit disjointed. I was following Ross Harrison's book on Bentham on this bit, especially talking about interest and attention as the connection between will and understanding, because it's not the case that you could directly influence belief just by interest. And I thought the idea of attention, that what you paid attention to is how interest indirectly influences the will. And Bentham says somewhere that the faculty of attention is a faculty of the will, not of the understanding. It's what. So to pay attention to something is to fasten your will onto something, and that is influenced by interest.
Yeah, that reminds me of a passage I know you'll be aware of in First Principles about disintellectualization, and in particular priests who always look at one side of the argument and ignore the other side. And I guess that's because that's what they're paid to do, and it's their interest to do that. So the will, in a sense, is directed to look at arguments in favour of religion, and that therefore, I suppose, corrupts the understanding. And I suppose the key people are the priests. And if you want, the best way to maintain this sort of system of delusion is to make the people who are propagating it actually believe in it.
Exactly. Yeah. So he says it's not, if they're merely paid, then they're just morally corrupt. But because people tend to want to be sincere about it, and I guess it's cognitive dissonance, so that's not a term that was around at the time. And so the intellectual corruption comes in actually trying to believe what you have been asked to believe.
Yeah, and that therefore makes the system, in a sense, all the more stronger, because the voters are not just being cynical.
Right.
Yeah. So it's not just So it's not just our interest, but we actually do believe this. I think that ties in neatly with what you're saying about the sort of sense more to it than sinister interest, and it also brings out what Bentham says about interest begotten prejudice, and the four things he lists in various places. Intellectual weakness, and how and that, I think that links in nicely with what you're saying about the relationships between interests and beliefs, and false and true beliefs. So I mean, let's. Are there any other? Who else has got questions before I keep going on?
Peter's got one for you.
Okay, Peter.
Hello,
This
can
is
you?
Peter Life, who's my PhD student.
Hi there. Yeah, thank you, and thank you for a fascinating paper. I just wanted to ask a question about you outlined in quite a lot of detail the problems that Bentham had with the Church of England and the Catechism, the priests, and so on and so forth. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about what you thought Bentham intended to do about it. I'm aware that different scholars have different views on the amount of the approach Bentham would take to the Church of England, and I just wondered what you thought. So was it Bentham's idea to reform the Church of England, to abolish the Church of England, to abolish religion more generally? Where would you stand on that particular scale?
Thank you so much. So he argues for disestablishment in the Church of Englandism. So I think that was the official position. And he talks a lot, not a lot, but he does mention freedom of religion in the United States of America as a place where there is no established church, and yet religion flourishes. And he has some nice things and non-terrible things to say about independent congregations in the first Not Paul but Jesus volume, how the church itself is authoritarian and tyrannical, but independent congregations are more democratic. So I think that's his position towards the church. And he was anti-clerical. If you're asking whether he wanted to abolish religion altogether, I don't think he would have said that, though I do not think he personally thought it of much use, really. But people must be allowed to believe what they want to believe, including the things that are wrong, and have that pointed out to them. And he himself was extremely irreligious. There's this wonderful thing by John Flower Coles. Have you read it? It's called Utilitarianism Unmasked. And he was one of Bentham's secretaries and later became a clergyman. and wrote a thing after Bentham's death about how terrible it was to live in Bentham's house and be forced to listen to all these anti-religious jokes at the breakfast table. So I take that Bentham's own views towards religion were not particularly respectful. But I don't think he called for the abolition of religion exactly, but he did call for disestablishment of the church. Philip looks like he wants to.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
You're on mute.
Peter, you come back if you like. Yeah, Peter, come back if you like.
Hi.
No.
No, I don't have a follow-up question. I just the reason I asked the question, I suppose, was yeah, I'm aware of, obviously he concludes in Church of Englandism specifically that he wanted to disestablish the church, but he was going to leave, as you say, the church buildings and the paraphernalia, if you like, of religion intact, so people would be free to worship on their own terms. I think it's James Crimmins who has written a couple of papers where he at first seemed to argue for that Bentham as the legislator would actually try to actively stamp out religion. I think he's perhaps tempered that view in a follow-up paper, but there is still obviously some debate about whether Bentham as the legislator would actively try to pull whatever levers he could to stamp out religion, or whether he would do what he could to cause people themselves to choose of their own volition not to be religious, which is slightly different. So, you know, it might sound like it's splitting the difference to some people, but yeah, it was more. I was just trying to get a sense of where you stood on that scale, but you've answered that.
No, thank you. I would tend towards the latter. I think that he would try and get people of their own volition not to believe in it. I think James Crimmins walked that back
Yeah.
a bit. Like
Yeah, I
they
think
had a
so.
milder version of it, which is, I guess, a little bit more towards the middle ground.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I suppose yeah, you also take away state support for religion. So instead of, you know, the state actively supporting the church, it just becomes neutral. And of course, you know, this is the age of Warburton's alliance of church and state. So that's you know, as we know, a radical position to take. And well, I know you know all about it, Peter, and the yeah, the turning the church into well, just letting the church die off slowly, the euthanasia of the church. I really like the suggesting that Oxford colleges should be turned into homes for retired servicemen. So yeah, coming back to Church of Englandism, the long introduction, which appears before the Catechism, where Bentham describes the meetings of the National Society based on I think it's the 3 annual reports of the National Society, and goes into great detail about how the minutes were presenting this active society where there were lots of members attending, whereas in fact it was probably just a bishop and his secretary. I mean, what in the collected works volume, I've just got it here at the side of me. That's I don't know. There's like 200 pages of that. I mean, what do you think Bentham's doing? Yeah, I'm asking sort of an intellectual history question here. A typical. Why do you think? What do you think Bentham's doing with that long introduction before he gets into the really, as you sort of said, the centerpiece, which is a scathing attack on the catechism? Why do you think he spends all that time worrying about, in a sense, the minutes of the meetings of the National Society?
I took it, and I confess that when I reread it, I skipped that bit. I took it to be
Very wise, probably.
To be related to its concern with mendacity and insincerity in the church. So part of the connected to the concern with Insuenon at all. And he's very exercised by the idea of mendacity in the church.
Yeah.
And so I took that to be part of the spuriousness of the whole enterprise, that it's set up on these false pretenses. Essentially, he goes into great detail to show that there are all these people in the committee who probably never quite existed. And as you say, it was just the bishop and the secretary who was signing up on these minutes. Is there something more that you feel should be taken at the moment?
That's. I was interested to see whether you know what you saw in it, because I think you're probably right. He's just saying, you know, this institution is so riddled with mendacity that even something so innocuous as these minutes is the whole thing is basically an act of delusion, or of you know, it's pretending that the National Society is something that it isn't. It's really just being left to the Bishop of London, whoever it is, to run it in the interests of the of the ruling classes. So I think that's probably right. So there's a question from Charbot Jai. It's in the meeting chat, and Charbot says, on Bentham's view of religion as delusion and representative democracy, first, is there any relevance for the relation between fake news and lies and the current crisis of democracy? And you have to be a political scientist now and not an intellectual historian. And secondly, how would Bentham explain that religion can still be very strong even in a very democratic society? And has religion changed radically since Bentham's time? So some interesting questions there from Charbot.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think. So I should preface this by saying that I am not American, and I do not follow American politics very closely, and the politics of my own country are somewhat different. It does feel like there is a crisis of judgment, and that is part of the crisis of democracy. I think Bentham, and Philip, you mentioned interest begotten prejudice, and I feel like in some of these later works, later political, constitutional works, Bentham was trying to figure out why these prejudices were still so strong in people, why they seemed to do things that were not entirely rational. The sinister interest can't explain all of the deviations from what utility would require. And so how would Bentham explain that religion can still be very strong in a very democratic society? I think in some ways, and this is a criticism of Bentham, that it's hard for him to account for some seemingly irrational but extremely strong feelings. And part of what I'm doing in this paper and some of the other papers is to say that Bentham was in some ways grappling with these issues, trying to explain why people thought as they did and did what they did, and that interest couldn't go all the way to explaining their actions. Has religion changed radically since Bentham's time? I suppose it depends on where does it. I can't speak for England. I would say that the church is not quite in the dominant position that it was in his time. I'm sorry, these might not be quite the answers you had in mind.
I don't know if Shabo wants to get back to us. I'm sure he will, but I mean, in terms of how religions changed, well, certainly in modern, let's say, modern Britain, the devil seems to have mainly disappeared, and you know, it's all about the pleasures of heaven rather than, you know, suffering the pains of hell. People may not believe hell exists anymore. I've got a question from Professor Fukugai. So Yasunori, please go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear?
We can hear you, yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Well, good evening. Well, your talk is very well organized, structured analysis of the discussion of Jeremy Bentham in terms of political thought. Well, in your analysis, the discussion of Bentham has the criterion of the meaning of the judgment. So religious belief may corrupt or obstruct of the decision making or develop the situation of the discussions among the peoples. But in considering some peculiar situation, there might be some special social or political situation that some kind of the religious belief may promote some good effect to promote the social situation in good way in the term of Bentham's angle. So how do you think in that kind of the issues? That is one. The other is my original research is on John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill has a kind of the volume on religion in latter period of his writings. One of the essay among three entitled as Utility of Religion. Utility means a kind of the some kind of the utilitarian meaning, but Bentham's different from Bentham's point. John Stuart Mill emphasis on the self-cultivation, self-culture of the ordinary people. So Bentham's idea is the faculty of judgment in terms of pleasure and pain or social utility. So how do you allocate the stream of the utilitarian ideas of the discussion in terms of the religion? That is the second one.
Thank you so much. So the first question was about whether religion could promote certain things which were socially desirable, certain kinds of social good. I think Bentham was careful, at least in the writings that were printed or published, to differentiate between whatever he was criticizing, the church or Pauline asceticism, and what he called the genuine religion of Jesus, which did promote values and qualities of behavior that were socially useful. And when he talks about the different kinds of sensibilities and whether these are socially useful or not, he doesn't entirely condemn religion. So it is possible, I think you're right, Professor, that religion could promote certain kinds of things which are useful. It's a question of whether or not you think he was trying to praise some core Christianity and criticize some more spurious version of this was just a disguise for criticizing the entirety of Christian doctrine. And my personal feeling is the latter, really. But in terms of what he actually says, he does acknowledge that there are things from Christian belief and practices that are good. And that he's only criticizing the church, only criticizing Paul, as it were. On John Stuart Mill, and I confess it's been a while since I read his religion, but I think he does actually say some good things about the analysis, if I'm not wrong, the analysis of the influence of natural religion. You're right that one difference between John Stuart Mill and Bentham, and this is what Mill says, is the emphasis on self-cultivation. I think that one of the attractive things about Bentham is the insistence that pleasure is pleasure, whether it's the pleasures of self-cultivation or some lesser, lower pleasures. And so yes, if you like, that is a difference, I think, between Mill and Bentham. Does that address your point? Did I understand it?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Well, in the stream of utilitarian ideas, the comparison between William Perry and Jeremy Bentham, that is one. The other is from Jeremy Bentham to John Stuart Mill is another story. So in terms of the judgment, Jeremy Bentham did not satisfied with the discussion of William Perry, because Perry's idea promotes the theological idea of the utilitarian discussions, but he just the religion may provide the guideline of the decision or human actions, but ordinary people should have the ability of the judgment. That is Bentham's point. So, your story provides a kind of angle between in the stream of Perry, Bentham, and John Stuart Mill. So, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Professor Caino in the chat is pressing you a little bit more in relation to what Professor Fukugai said. He apologises for being wrong, but Bentham, he says, seems to have argued that the religion of Jesus could inspire social motives. It's not easy to reconcile Bentham's remark and today's talk. Could you please explain further? So that's from Professor Caino.
Thank you so much. I think Bentham would say that he's criticizing the church and not the religion of Jesus, separate from the practices of the church. So he does say that he thinks the church is promoting Church of Englandism, its own religion, as a substitute for the genuine religion of Jesus. So then that allows him to say things like the religion of Jesus could inspire social motives and to criticize the practices of the established church. And part of what he was arguing against, as we were talking a little bit about earlier, was not so much religion in general, but the church and religious establishment. So I think that's how he would square that circle.
Yeah, I mean, there's one there's one point, I think it's in the Juggernaut manuscripts, where Bentham explains his strategy and says he'll start off by in a sense it's like a military campaign. He'll start by demolishing the established church, Church of Englandism, and then because people can then move on to natural religion, so he will then attack natural religion, and people think, well, we still have revealed religion. Then he will attack Paul, and people will still think, well, we've still got Jesus. And so the last bastion is Jesus. And I think, from what you're right, Bentham has much more sympathy with Jesus's teachings than he does with Paul's, because there's a sense in which Jesus has an Epicurean element to his teaching. But then there's what I think I always thought was a very amusing passage where Bentham comments on the Sermon on the Mount, where he basically says at the end of it, if only Jesus had not said these things, but rather repeated what I said in Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, this would be fine. So, I think what you say. I think I broadly agree with that. Yes, some of Jesus's doctrines can be seen to be would promotive of utility, perhaps more so when they were in Jesus's time than now, because now, of course, we've got Bentham, so we don't need Jesus anymore.
There's a wonderful bit in Otto Icon where he talks about how they could stage a little thing between Bentham's Otto Icon and Plato and Aristotle and various other people. I can't remember Jesus is in that lineup, but yes, so
yeah.
And display the superiority of utilitarianism over the others.
Yeah, that's right. I just wanted to go back to the relationship between public opinion and democracy, because I mean, in one of the questions is how does Bentham expect us, the society to move to constitutional code? How are we going to get constitutional code implemented? How are we going to get a representative democracy where there's no a republic, no monarch and no aristocracy, no church, and he has to. I think maybe he thinks we do this through public opinion. And as you said, there are still problems with public opinion. Doesn't think the same way as Bentham. There's all this delusion, all this effort being put into deluding people so they don't recognise their true interests. So if we are to get to representative democracy, we need public opinion to get us there. But how do we enlighten public opinion? And so that sort of ties in with the view of religion as which you've been putting forward as, in a sense, uncorrupting our judgments, so that we reform public opinion. Then public opinion gets us to republicanism. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
But then that brings us to the problem of sort of the persistence of religion and sort of Bentham's attempts failed because first of all, none of this stuff ever got published, very little of it. And like you say, when it did, it had a very small circulation. And Bowring himself, Bentham's editor, excluded the religious writings which had been published from the Bowring edition. So it didn't turn out to be a very successful strategy.
No.
Sorry, that was meant to be a question, but it turned into a long statement. I'm sorry about that. The other thing that occurred to me was, when you're talking about the catechism and the effect on children, I wonder, I'm sure Bentham did have in mind his own experience at Oxford when he questioned the 39 articles of the Church of England and said he was sent to some college official who told him that it was not for youths, uninformed youths such as him and his whoever the friends he was with, to question the authority of wise churchmen. and there's also a sense there of the ancestors worship fallacy, in that, you know, the 39 articles were decided by these wise men many years ago. There are ancestors that were wiser than us, and therefore don't question them.
Yeah, I think he says somewhere that this is bowing to the blindly assumed infallibility of an earlier age, or something like that, Church of Englandism. And the other link, a rather more an intellectual link to his childhood, was that Bentham talked a bit about how terrifying the stories of the devil were for children. And I guess he himself was afraid of ghosts, and he talked about how the catechism introduced all these ideas and pictures and stories that would just be really frightening. So possibly he was drawing on his own experiences.
Yeah. Are there any other questions? I mean, there's so much in Tsin Yen's paper that it's been a real delight, I think, this morning. And you know, thank you very much for presenting that to us. And you know, I look forward very much to seeing this develop and seeing it in print. Really fascinating, and will be a great contribution, I think, to our understanding of Bentham. And you know, the more work that like this which is done, then the more it gives the light of the delusion about Bentham being a rather simplistic and sort of reductionist philosopher. Reductionist meant in a dyslogistic sense. So Tsin Yen, thank you very much indeed. That's terrific, and I'm sure we're all giving you a virtual clap. And just to remind people that we will have thank you. We have our final Bentham seminar next, well, for this series in 2 weeks' time, when Scott Jack, the criminologist from Georgia State University, will be speaking. And because Scott Jack is in the United States, I'm afraid the timing of the seminar will be back to 5 o'clock UK time. So I'm sorry for those of you who are from Japan and Singapore. It will mean another late night, but you can always catch up on the Bentham Project YouTube channel, because this series, like the others in this seminar, like the others in the series, has been recorded. So once again, thanks, Tsin Yen. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much for inviting me. As it was really useful. Thank you. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And there's some appreciative comments in the chat there as well.